Why do central banks want digital currencies, and what do they mean for you? If we think about the monetary system right now, when central banks implement quantitative easing, for example, what they do is basically that they inject liquidity into the economy, but the increase in money supply is distributed through the banking mechanism. The transmission mechanism of monetary policy, therefore, has a number of stops, including your demand for credit, the business's demand for credit. Therefore, if the central bank implements very aggressive monetary policies and the increase in money supply is enormous, what tends to happen is that there are a number of backstops that permit a lower level of inflation. Even with such mechanism, inflation has happened all over the world. Now let's think of what a central bank digital currency does. What happens is that you would have your account directly at the central bank. And therefore, when the central bank implements monetary expansion, for example, it would immediately push that money into your account, and it would have all of the information about where you spend it on, what do you do with that money, and how much do you decide to save, how much do you decide to spend, and where. Not only just that, also what we need to understand is that the risk of eliminating the backstops that reduce the risk of inflation creates a much larger inflationary pressure. If the central bank decides to eliminate the transmission mechanism of money policy, of money supply and monetary policy, what it ends up literally doing is that if there is an excessive amount of money injected in the system, it would immediately appear in prices of goods and services. It would not just create inflation in assets, as quantitative easing does. It would also create immediate levels of inflation in all goods and services. It obviously puts at risk the purchasing power of the currency, because central banks tend to err not on the side of caution, but on the side of excess. So the biggest risk of money creation is that it's never neutral. Money creation always disproportionately negatively affects savers and real wages, and disproportionately benefits the first recipients of that newly created money, which are governments and the highly indebted sectors. The risk of central bank digital currencies is that, one, it eliminates the transmission mechanism of money supply. Two, that it could be viewed as surveillance disguised as money. Central bank would have all of the information about what you do and what you do with your money. And third, that the risk of inflationary pressures would be higher because the purchasing power of the currency could be destroyed rather quickly. Furthermore, it is very likely that these central bank digital currencies will be fungible, which means that newly created money will appear in your bank, but it could also disappear from the bank if the central bank, quote unquote, finds that you save way too much. In essence, it is not a very good idea. And it's not a very good idea to start with, because the independence of central banks has been criticized, and rightly so, and put into question in a period in which excessive monetary policy has fundamentally benefited governments, government debt, and government spending. Furthermore, it has evidence that the risk of not combating inflation rapidly enough is already here, is clear on everything that we're seeing on the changes in the monetary policy and in the changes in the hike rates decisions from central banks. They tend to err on the side of excess. So a digital currency that does include a lot of the mistakes of monetary policy as we know it right now, but adds a significant number of the mistakes that can happen in heavily intervened central banks or heavily government-linked central banks, is even larger. As such, we have to be at least aware of the risk of having currencies that will be surveillance disguised as money. Second, that will be heavily inflationary. And third, that it could certainly destroy the confidence in the currency in the long term. So let's pay attention to this risk because it's not small. Recession risk is very evident. The global yield curve is already inverted. And if we look at the United States, more than 70% of the yield curve is inverted. And this has always signaled a coming recession. It's not just that the yield curve is inverting, is that we also have very important factors that we should take into account. The global tech layoff is not just because the stocks are falling or have fallen, but because they see that the economy is certainly stagnating and slowing down much faster than what we see as macroeconomists. If there's anybody out there that knows how the economy is really doing, it is global tech giants. They see everything at exactly every second. Not just that, it's more than the yield curve. It's the fact that we should be growing at much faster rates, even considering the challenges of the Ukraine invasion and the slowdown of China, after the monster stimulus packages of 2020 and 2021. Think about this. The multiplier effect of these stimulus plans has been absolutely atrocious, completely negative. There is absolutely no real multiplier effect and certainly no potential growth improvement after trillions of dollars of spending and increase of money supply. If we for once start to analyze the atrocious impact of these wrongly called stimulus plans, we should be very prudent in the next few years. Because what we know now is that they leave a massive trail of debt, certainly slower growth, weaker wage growth, certainly weaker employment growth, and what is more concerning is that the real disposable income of families is vanishing. So what we need to understand is that in the process of the following next months, now that they don't have the excuse of the Ukraine war, commodities have round-tripped. The oil price is now negative on the year. The wheat prices are also negative on the year. We have a lot of the commodities at much lower prices than they were in January of 2022. So the commodity excuse is over. The Ukraine war excuse obviously over. The supply chain disruption excuse is over. That has all but vanished, considering what is happening globally with freight charges, which are also down on the year. After taking away all those excuses, the reality is that even with those challenges, the global economy, particularly the developed ones that implemented those absolutely atrocious stimulus plans, should have been growing at faster levels, and is not just not growing, but it is also weakening and weakening quickly. So recession is not in spite of stimulus plans. Recession is not a risk that comes because there were no stimulus plans. Recession is a direct consequence of those absolutely misguided stimulus plans that have not stimulated the economy, and the only thing that they've achieved is to bloat government spending, bloat debt, increase inflation, and weaken the prospects of the middle class and businesses to improve productivity and consumption. In the past 2 weeks, we have heard a number of pieces of news saying that governments need to implement price caps on food, price caps on energy. First, we need to understand the following. Governments do not reduce prices. Governments increase prices. How do governments increase prices? One, through taxation. Put in taxes on all the chain of from production to transport and delivery, distribution and commercialization. But not just through taxation, but governments also create inflation by promoting and incentivizing the destruction of the purchasing power of the currency. So governments are rarely going to really fight inflation, and certainly price caps do not reduce inflation. Just think about this. Argentina has had 50 years of price caps and so-called price controls, and they have one of the highest levels of inflation in the region and in the world. Price caps are just a disguise to try to show you that governments care about inflation, but governments do not care about inflation because the biggest beneficiary of inflation is government. Governments can receive more tax receipts because the taxationary impact on the added tax is higher, and therefore they receive more revenues. Second, because the higher level of inflation reduces the amount of debt that they have accumulated in the periods of excess. So every time that you hear that governments are going to impose a price cap, remember, one, you're going to pay for it. Two, it is not a price cap. At best, it is going to be passing you the bill next year. Third, governments don't take prices down, governments elevate prices. The Chinese slowdown has been put under the umbrella of the zero-COVID policy. Certainly, the zero-COVID policy is important, and certainly it impacts the Chinese economy. Let's think about this. The lockdowns in China are affecting about 25% of the GDP. This has created a significant impact on the global economy as well. First, lower growth globally, certainly. More importantly, an indirect stimulus for the developed economies. Why? Because China is a massive consumer of commodities, and therefore, by consuming less, it has certainly helped the round trip that we have seen in oil, in copper, in food prices, etc., because all of those factors have been helped by the slowdown in demand from China. But there's also an important factor for the Chinese slowdown, and not all of it is the COVID zero policy. The other very important factor is the burst of the real estate bubble, and that actually has more long-term ramifications than what we would imagine initially, especially if we put everything under the umbrella of COVID zero policies. The burst of the real estate bubble is very important in numerous ways. To start with, the collapse in house prices in China is evidence of a model that was based on bloating GDP through construction. The second is that the level of savings of Chinese citizens in the bonds of real estate companies was quite significant, and many of those companies are actually going into default, hence creating a significant problem as well for citizens and their savings, which are literally disappearing as we speak. Furthermore, when a real estate sector, real estate plus construction, directly and indirectly, weight about 25 to 28% of GDP in China. When it weighs so much, it is virtually impossible to offset the impact of its slowdown with the growth of the new economy, which is certainly growing fantastically. And there's obviously a tremendous level of double-digit growth in sectors that are of high added value. However, it's virtually impossible to offset the impact on GDP of the real estate sector with other specifically technology or, for example, services. It's also important from the perspective of the currency and the financial aspect. The regions in China have a very high dependence on selling land for real estate purposes in order to generate revenues for their public services. Many of the regions are actually going into very important levels of financial problems because of the loss of revenues coming from the real estate sector. This, in turn, puts more pressure on the yuan, puts more pressure on the central bank to continue to inject liquidity and therefore weaken the currency. And certainly it puts a lot of pressure on the government, which continues to increase debt in a country that already has a very elevated level of debt. Therefore, the reopening is going to be an important positive factor, but we must remember that it can create significant inflationary pressures on commodities. Second, even with the reopening, which is likely to be gradual, what is very likely to happen as well is that the slowdown in the real estate and construction sector will continue to be significant and therefore reducing potential growth. Third, the situation of the central bank in China continues to be one of being extremely accommodative, but at the same time prudent in its monetary policy. Therefore, it is very likely that it will do whatever it can to avoid a financial crisis, but at the same time not implement a massive monetary stimulus and certainly not another massive fiscal stimulus that ends up creating a larger problem of excessive spending in so-called infrastructure and construction, i.e. bloating GDP building stuff. The challenges of China are important, and the opportunities in the high growth, high added value sectors remain, but we must be vigilant about the expectations of a quick reopening that changes the trend of growth that we have seen so far in the past decade. The latest expectations for Latin America show a very concerning situation. Latin America is on the verge of a lost decade. It's not just a situation created by the COVID-19 crisis or by the Ukraine war. Actually, Latin America should be one of the main beneficiaries of the Ukraine invasion because as commodity producers, many of these countries are seeing a tailwind from the higher levels of demand for food, for oil, for copper, etc. So, the first thing that we need to understand is that the very aggressive downgrades of growth in Latin America are coming in a time in which it should be, as a region, growing faster than developed economies. Second, inflation. The destruction of purchasing power of the local currency is one of the big trends of the last decade. And what we have seen in Argentina and Venezuela and other countries is likely to continue with populist governments that continue to say that they're going to spend a lot more with a financing coming from higher printing of currency. Colombia, Chile. We have a lot of countries in which populist measures are affecting potential growth in three ways. On the first one is the risk of investment and legal security by constantly changing the laws in order to implement populist policies. The second is the risk to property rights. The moment that risks to property rights start, investment goes away from those countries. The third is destruction of the purchasing power of the currency via monster monetary policy, as we have seen in Argentina. And many populist governments actually think that the reason why it didn't work in Argentina, or it didn't work in Ecuador before the dollarization, or it didn't work in Venezuela, is because they did not implement it. And that's a big, big mistake. Latin America is facing a lost decade. It was already growing slower than its potential prior to the COVID-19 crisis. It has recovered much slower. More importantly, now it faces the risk of lower investment, weaker currencies, and a prolonged period of stagnation with high inflation because of the wrong policies. Let's pay a lot of attention to this because it's a very important region for the world, and certainly one in which poverty is coming from the mistaken, misguided, wrong policies.